Okay, so we're talking about misunderstandings, famous misunderstandings, which lead to mistaken critiques of the Torah's content or positions on things. I want to introduce this by a general idea, which I'm not going to explore in detail, and then talk about a particular detailed application of it. About 20 years ago, Professor Jonathan Ostroff of York University, who was a student here many years ago, sent me an email reminding me of something that everybody knows, and I know it also, but sometimes we don't use it. We don't remember to bring it into a discussion. Suppose someone asks, why did God create our world, a world with death and disease and accidental injury and pain and loss and damage, and also so much what are called natural evils? Why did he create a world like this? What was his purpose in making this world? And what we forget to answer is, he didn't. He didn't make this world. He made Gan Eden. In Gan Eden, there was no death, no disease, and no injury, and no famine, and no war. It was Guadalajara. It was the land of eternal spring. No clothes, no houses, no need for physical effort. The world ran on its own. He made a world without any of these things that people today call evil. They came into the world as a result of disobedience, that the people there ate from the tree of knowledge, and therefore the world deteriorated in various ways. Now you could ask a secondary question, well, why were all of these terrible consequences necessary and useful in the face of that failure? You could ask that question, but it's not the original question. The original question makes it sound like God's purpose is death and disease and accident and famine and plague. That's his purpose, because that's what he created the world for. That question is off the books. You'd have to understand in detail what the failure meant and why these things were relevant as a response to the failure. But that's an entirely different question. Yeah.
Just so I understand, you're saying that God didn't create all of these things that extended from the sins that man did? Because we can't say that they're separate.
Again, the world that he created did not have these things in it. In the Garden of Eden, none of these things were in existence. Yeah. If they had fulfilled his will, right, they never would have become practical, never would become actual. Their potentiality is the background as a response to failure. But you can't read God's purposes from the potential response to failure. You read his purposes from his commands and the fulfillment of his commands, which would be the ideal outcome. This is not the ideal outcome. This is an outcome which is second best because his command wasn't fulfilled. Now, one detail in that sort of mental set is the idea of the difference between Jews and non-Jews. Why is there a two-tiered system? Obviously, the Jews are special in some ways, many ways. Not only do they have extra commandments, a whole slew of extra commandments, but they have a special relationship with God, special closeness, special purpose, and the way in which they interact with God. Why did God create humanity on two levels, one obviously superior to the other? What does it say about God? Is God an elitist and only wants the minority to succeed and doesn't want the majority to succeed? And you could read all sorts of political and sociological and other incompetent academic motivations into it. When I went to graduate school, I was accepted to Harvard. I didn't go to Harvard for several reasons, one of which was the policy at that time was to take in the first graduate class a certain number of students, and 2/3 of them would be failed out, and only 1/3 went on to the second year. Well, I didn't think that was a healthy academic atmosphere, so I opted out of it. There you could read their purposes, because that's what they set up as the norm. They didn't set it up as a backup for failure. They set it up as the norm. So here, the question why God wanted to be a two-tiered humanity gets the same response. He didn't. He didn't set it up that way. He didn't plan it that way. And in fact, he made numerous efforts to avoid that outcome. That outcome is only the result of unfortunate free human choices. This is in the Way of God by Luzzatto, part 1. He details this, and I'll take you through it so you see how it works. In Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, there were Adam and Chava, two people, and they were given a command not to eat from the tree of knowledge. Had they fulfilled the command, that would have been the end of active history. End. No two groups there, no upper group and lower group. And even though our sources tell us they would have had lots and lots of children, it would have been one homogeneous humanity. That was the ideal. That was the plan and the hope, so to speak, that those two people would actually fulfill the command they were given, and humanity would be on one level. Okay, they failed. As a result of their failure, the entire creation took a giant step down. Again, I'm quoting Rabbi. One way to picture this is as follows. Imagine the world consists of spirituality and physicality. So, Adam and Chava were on a certain level where they had their spirituality and their physicality. When they failed this challenge, the whole world went down a whole step, meaning that what was their physicality became the spirituality of the lower world. Below that, a new level of physicality was created, and the original spirituality is out of reach. We're a whole level down. Now, that whole level down cannot fulfill the purpose of creation. So somehow, contact has to be made with the original level, and somehow we have to recover the challenge and the success that was meant for the first level. How you do is a complicated story, but remaining in this lowered world means that in those conditions alone, the purpose of the world cannot be achieved. So, the Ramchal says, we went through a period of time where people were challenged to make contact with that higher level. And Ramchal says, anyone and everyone could have done it. The door was open for anyone and everyone to do it. And the ideal outcome of this period of history would be for everyone to make contact, everyone to recover that kind of reality, and all of humanity would be a uniform group, all of whom are in contact with that original reality. Only Abraham did it. So that set up a difference between Abraham on the one hand and everybody else. Because Abraham is in contact with that reality, and he therefore can go through a process of reattaching himself to the purpose of creation, whereas the other ones can't. But that's only stage 2. Now, the 70 nations come into existence. And Abraham is building his own family and his own clan, and he converts people. The door is open, says the Ramchal, in this third period, for anyone or any group to graft itself onto Abraham's clan and become part of his people, and become relevant to the original position of the world, and play the same part as Abraham. And the ideal would have been for everyone to take that step and to join him, and nobody did. That's part 3. Then comes part 4, which is the giving of the Torah. Now, some of you may know, it's a midrash that says that God went to every nation in the world at that time and offered them the Torah. Offered them the Torah the same way he offered us the Torah. Let's just recall a few facts. The actual revelation of Sinai took place on the 6th of Sivan. On the 4th of Sivan, 2 days earlier, Moses said to the people, the Creator has a Torah, and he wants to give it to you. What do you say? No fire on the mountain, no sounds of the shofar, no ground shuddering under their feet, just Moses making a proposal. The Jewish people accepted it. Other nations were given an equal chance. Their leaders, king, the high priest, whoever it was, came to the people and asked them, the Creator of the universe has a Torah, we're offering it to you, take and let us know if you want to take it or you don't want to take it. Now, again, a detail, but it's important to keep in mind. Don't make a mistake. It wasn't that another nation could have it and we not. The proposal was another nation could join us in receiving it. Our receiving it is built in. That's something which is unavoidable. Our sources tell us that had the Jews not received the Torah at Sinai, the whole world would have gone back to dissolution. The creation would have been undone. That's unnecessary. But everybody else could have joined us, which would have meant if all the other nations had volunteered to join us, then the Torah would have been given to all mankind, and you would have had a one-tiered humanity, not two tiers, an upper tier and a lower tier. Everyone would have been equal. We would all have the Torah together, and there would have been one humanity. That's 4 different opportunities for everyone to reach the same level. That was God's offering to provide it to everyone, and all 4 times the answer was no. So that being the case, we're left with the Jewish people receiving the Torah and the rest of the world not. Even now, after that, I call this 4.5 chances. Any non-Jew can become a Jew. Many have. Many have contributed invaluable contributions to the Jewish people. The ideal solution, reconciliation for this period of history would be for all non-Jews to become Jews. In which case, again, there would be a single nation, a single-tiered humanity. You wouldn't have a higher group and a lower group. That's what would have been ideal. So obviously, from this description, God's purpose in making the world was not there should be an upper group and a lower group. It wasn't elitist. It wasn't selectionist. It wasn't a question of favoring some over others. His hope was to reach all of mankind. And since the decisions that people made didn't express that, so then this distinction in levels has remained, although it could be overcome now by anybody who wants to take that step. Now you have a question?
So, at the different stages, let's take the last stage with when the Torah is given. At that stage, we have undergone the Yam Suf, we have undergone the miracles in Mitzrayim, so we might not have then the shofar and all the thunder at that point, but we have seen like Hashem's hand very clearly. So there is something sort of favoring our choice, which other nations don't necessarily have.
Well, I'm not now talking about guilt or I'm not talking about whether they should be despised because they didn't make the right choice. I'm not talking about that.
Yes,
I assume that God gave it to them in a way that was relevant to them, relevant to their history, relevant to their culture, relevant to fulfilling their aspirations.
So the idea here is that it was a fair offer to them as well in terms of the
Sure.
probability they would accept it.
Well, probably God knows the outcome before He does it. But the challenge in accepting it would be a similar challenge.
Okay.
Then get back to our free will discussion about knowing something before they do.
Yeah, okay.
But then how could no one else choose to if it was a similar challenge? That seems crazy that the outcome was that everyone said no if it was...
Oh, so now the question what it means by everyone. I talked about nations.
Mhm.
We understand, we mentioned something like this the other day, we understand that it wasn't unanimous. It wasn't unanimous. There were people, maybe in every nation, who said yes, but they were outvoted. And one of the explanations for where converts come from is from those people, those souls that said yes. Since they said yes to a life of Torah, that yes has to be answered. And with some descendant that carrying that soul in the future who becomes a convert. One of the ways to explain why some non-Jews are inspired to look and seek and find and change, and others are not. There are other answers as well, but that's one of the answers. Yeah.
question, but does that mean Amalek was also given the opportunity to have the Torah?
Yes. Now the question is, you see, Amalek is a grandson of Esau, so he's really part of Edom.
Yes.
He's not a separate, right? But if he functioned as a separate nation, he'll be separate from Edom. If not, not. I know he's called Rashis Goyim Amalek, so I don't know, but he's part of Edom. Every nation was given an opportunity.
And I guess the other question is, if other nations had accepted the Torah, would the writings of the Torah be different, or?
Oh, that's a very good question. That's a very good question. You're opening up this is going to take me about 10 minutes at least to answer. It's a very, very good question. We have, this question that you're asking now would apply to what I said 12 minutes and 42 seconds ago, approximately, that the priority for God was that people should fulfill the command of not eating from the tree of knowledge, and thereby that would have been the end of active history. That's what I said. This is the granddaddy of this question, right? The whole Torah talks about what happened after the transgression, and all of that seems like it wouldn't be true. So the kernel of the answer is this. There is a disagreement in terms of the parts of the Torah that describe building the tabernacle. Were the instructions of the tabernacle given after the golden calf as a way of recovering from the transgression of the golden calf? Or were they given before? So if you say they were given after the golden calf, it sounds like the tabernacle was given as a way to recover from the golden calf. And then you have to ask, if the golden calf hadn't happened, what would all of those instructions have meant, since the golden calf didn't happen? So I boiled down a giant question to one question. I'm going to boil it down to a very tiny observation. There's a verse which says, "Umaltem es orlas levavchem," you shall circumcise the foreskins of your hearts. Now, as a matter of fact, anatomically, the heart is enclosed in a membrane. But this verse is not commanding open heart surgery. No, it is not. Sorry, everybody would die in those times if they undid the membrane surrounding the heart. So this is a spiritual idea expressed in physical terms. It's a spiritual idea expressed in physical terms. Foreskin is something that covers something up and doesn't enable it to function freely and fully. By taking it off, you release that functionality, and you can have spiritual blockages as well. And it means remove those spiritual blockages, which means you have a verse which is written in physical terms and could be indicating a spiritual performance. In this case, it's forced on you because the Torah is not commanding open heart surgery, but that teaches you something about the way the Torah expresses itself. Now, as a matter of fact, gold and silver and turquoise thread, the colors all represent spiritual qualities. And certain types of shapes and certain types of materials represent spiritual qualities. So, the instructions for making the tabernacle could be instructions for meditation. They didn't have to be realized physically. That means that the text is two-way ambiguous. If there's a golden calf, then you'll do it physically. If there isn't a golden calf, then you'll do it spiritually. Therefore, the text could be applied either way that history works out. Now, this is we say that the talmidim of a scholar, his disciples, are his children because of a verse in the Torah which talks about teaching your children. Doesn't mean your biological children. It says children. Well, your children are an expression of your DNA, your biological children. That DNA makes them in some way similar to you, and they grow up with you, and that means they carry a lot of you into the future, so do your disciples. So there, the word ben can mean a disciple who carries you into the future, similarly to the way your biological children carry you into the future. So many words can be understood both physically and spiritually. Now, if we go back to, let's say, the Garden of Eden, the Zohar has a very poignant remark. The Zohar says that included in the prohibition against eating the tree of knowledge and the positive mitzvah of eating from the other trees, which you probably haven't heard about, but there is such an idea, were included all 613 commandments, all of them. How could that be? And how can an MP3 player hold 14 years of music? Things can be compressed in certain ways. So the idea is that the Torah, on that kind of understanding, on that kind of interpretation, could indeed have been actualized in the period of time in the Garden of Eden. This also helps with a piece of Gemara that people know from Shuas, that when Moses went up to Mount Sinai to get the Torah, the angels complained and said, "Why are you giving it to them? They're not going to succeed. They're going to mess it up. And the whole universe is going to suffer because they control the flow of divine energy into the universe. Give it to us," said the angels, "and we'll do a much better job." Yeah, but a lot of the mitzvahs are physical. They require physical actions, activities. So what's their thought that they could fulfill these mitzvahs? So for one example, which I forget who I heard this from, take honoring your parents. Do angels have parents? Well, yes and no. They don't have flesh and blood parents. But each angel embodies a principle of action. The word angel in Hebrew, malach, means agent, not messenger. If you talk messenger, that's wrong. Malachim do other things besides carry messages. He's an agent to carry out some task, some responsibility. Now, when you have rules for action, you can have rule A and rule B, and when you put them together, you can derive from A and B rule C, which now is more narrow, more circumscribed. A and B are more general, and C is more narrow and applies to more specific cases. Imagine two malachim, which embody these two general principles of action, and then you combine them together logically. You derive C, and then you tell C, don't step outside the bounds of A and B. That's where you came from. You came into existence as a consequence of B and C. Don't step outside the boundaries of A and B. That could be respecting your parents on an abstract level, on a spiritual level, or on a level of logic. So the Torah is multiply ambiguous. It can be realized in different ways, in different circumstances, and that's why we don't have to worry that had it gone differently at a particular period of time, the Torah wouldn't have been true. That's a general program. It would have to be filled out in detail for all the possibilities that one can conceive of, but that's the general principle. Yeah.
Do we say that the seed of the idea of davening was built into the rules for bringing a korban or the offerings like back then?
Okay, let me answer this because this will correct a very widespread misimpression. From your words, you may be guilty of this misimpression as well. People will tell you prayers were invented when the first temple was destroyed, and they were invented to fill in the missing sacrifices. Prayer instead of sacrifices. Well, that's historically wrong. First of all, the organized prayer services, the structure of statutory prayer started at the beginning of the Second Temple. And they went side by side with sacrifices for 120 years. So it was not for the sake of the missing sacrifices, number one. Number two, what you said is very, very, very accurate now. If you look carefully at the temple itself, you will see that prayers are foreshadowed in the temple. And there are at least two sources. There's a famous verse in Isaiah. It's famous because it's a popular song. I will bring them to my holy mountain, and I will cause them to rejoice in my house of prayer. I will cause them to rejoice in my house of prayer. What house is that? That's the temple. Their sacrifices shall be for my acceptance on the altar, because my house is a house of prayer for all peoples. Now you figure that one out. House of prayer, sacrifices, house of prayer. How does that go together? Somehow, the place where the sacrifices are offered is called the house of prayer. That's its title. Not a house of sacrifices, but a house of prayer. So obviously, the prayer and the sacrifices are intimately related to one another. When you talk about the rabbis imitating the structure of sacrifices by the structure of prayer, that's built into the words of this prophet. Okay, that's Isaiah. But let's go back to Solomon. Solomon built the temple. After he built it, he gives a dedicatory prayer, and he speaks about that God should be there and see what's done there, and pay attention to what's done there, respond to what's done there. His whole speech mentions only prayer. It's astonishing. There isn't a word about sacrifices, not a word, not a syllable. It's only about prayer. So from the very beginning of the house, it's dedicated to prayer. And towards the end of the first temple, Isaiah says there's a house of prayer. So obviously, prayer and sacrifices are intimately related. When the rabbis wanted to create a companion to sacrifices, because roughly the intuition was, how do sacrifices work? Well, the Kohanim every day go through certain offerings. Am I there? I'm not a Kohen. Am I represented? Oh, sure. I'm there because once a year in Hadar I pay my half shekel. I'm a good guy. I give him my half shekel. So on July 16th, when they're offering the morning offering at 8 a.m., and I'm sleeping till noon, but I'm there. Because in March I paid my half shekel, and therefore my name is on every sacrifice that's offered there. The rabbi said that's not enough. That's not good enough. We need national participation in the sacrificial offerings. So prayer is an extension of the sacrificial offerings. It means that the whole of the people engages itself in the sacrificial offerings, because prayer and sacrificial offerings are really two sides of one coin. Now, I wrote an essay on this in my first book, my first Jewish book, The Informed Soul. So it's in the library upstairs, so you can see it there. But this is exactly right. The germs of prayer are in the temple from the very beginning. There was a famous Jewish historian, not religious. I have to think of his name. And he wrote, people who think that the prayers were invented to replace the missing sacrifices can't explain how a conquered and exiled nation had enough continuity and enough unity to invent such a practice. It can't be that it was invented in Babylon. If it didn't come from before, they wouldn't have been able to invent it there. Is that the idea of the prayers? He reversed it and said, he's a historian. He said, what I know about the history, if it wasn't there, it would have been lost. Okay, so now, yeah.
Going back to earlier, you said that there were 4 opportunities to create like a oneness. Is there any significance behind the number 4?
That's an interesting thought. There is, obviously, the number 4 is very important. But how would it function here? I don't know. I mean, I could make something up, but I would have no reason to think it was true.
He said 4.5 or 5.
Yeah, I said 4.5, 5. But there are 2 divine names. One has 4 letters, one has 5 letters. You could play with it and make up anything you want. I don't know. I have no information about it, so I would be afraid to play with it. Okay, everybody with me so far? Now, let me tell you some things about this which may not be quite so acceptable on the outside, but this is the true understanding of it. Let's think of mankind, humanity. God created Adam and Chava in the Garden of Eden. Had they succeeded in not eating from the tree of knowledge, the story would have been over. They would have had descendants, but all on one level. Is that mankind? Would that have been mankind? Sounds like it. Under those conditions, nobody else, no other history, nothing else happens. Okay, now, they failed, the world went down a level, and we have to try to recover, and in the end of the day, it's the Jewish people who recover that connection to the original reality. Should we infer from those two facts that maybe, this is going to be really, really radical, maybe Adam and Chava were Jewish? Maybe the Jewish people is the expression of the original mankind. Because after all, they are the ones who are carrying the relationship to the original reality through which the world can reach its fulfillment. And I did say 11 and a half minutes ago, but since I didn't emphasize it, people didn't stop and think about it, that the Zohar, as in it, says that the tree of knowledge had in it all 613 commandments. Aren't the 613 commandments the Jewish commandments? And we're being told that the tree of knowledge had in it the 613 commandments. Yeah. So in a certain sense, the right thing to think is that Adam and Chava were in a certain sense Jewish, and the result of the crash was that mankind was lowered to a condition where not the whole of Jewish identity could be expressed, and the hope was to climb back to where the whole of that original identity could be expressed. Now, of course, expressing a Jewish identity in our lowered world will not have the same picture as that identity in the Garden of Eden, but it will be that identity. And therefore, our sources tell us that when the Jews stood at Sinai and they were receiving the Torah, based on verses, they were immortal. Death had been rescinded, just like it was in the Garden of Eden. Sorry?
So when Hashem was speaking to the Jewish people, how did so many of them die? Like when they heard his voice, if they were immortal, how did they die?
There's a big difference between a 3-second death and a permanent death, or a death waiting for resurrection. That's
if you're
what.
immortal, you don't die at all.
Okay, you're right. Except for that momentary transition to death, which is supposed to be part of the experience. After all, it says that they died on hearing the first word. He had a whole 10 pronouncements to make. So it wasn't in the cards that they weren't going to make it, be buried and that body disintegrate in the earth and all the rest of that. But you're good. I'll have to say, except for that momentary experience, which was part of where the continuing life was supposed to be. But death and burial and disintegration of the body and resurrection, that was canceled. And only when the golden calf was made did they return back to the condition that they were in before that. And indeed, there's a Shem Shmuel who says that if you look carefully at the conditions of Sinai, you can see that they are a replay of the test in the Garden of Eden. And he points out that, according to certain authorities in the Gemara, let's work on the calendar now. Moses said to the people, prepare yourselves for 2 days, and on the third day God will give the Torah. Moses said to the people, prepare yourselves for 3 days. That doesn't sound like what God said. He said, prepare for 2. Moses said, prepare for 3. So some say, Moses said, I want an extra day, God. Don't appear on the third day, appear on the fourth day. And God said, okay. 3 things that Moses did on his own, and God agreed to. Now, the Gemara tells us that the Torah was given on Shabbos. So the Torah was given on Shabbos. What day did God plan to give it on? -1 is Friday. Friday. God planned to give the Torah on Friday. And then the Torah has lots of mitzvahs in it, right? Do we have anything else on record where something came into existence on Friday and had lots of mitzvahs?
Human beings.
How about Adam was created on the 6th day of the week, Friday, and he was given commandments by God, right? God wanted a replay of the Garden of Eden. They were immortal, I make you immortal. It's Friday, the commandments. Moses said, no deal.
Why?
No deal. Why did Moses say no deal? So the Shem Yishul explains as follows. He says, what was the aftermath? The aftermath of the Garden of Eden was a gigantic crash, a whole lowering of the whole world, and an expulsion of the Garden of Eden. What will happen if the Jews crash this time also? Maybe God will just sever connection, and they'll wander on without, or something else will happen. Moses said, I want to guarantee that even if they fail, the connection will be permanent. Now, there's a difference between Shabbos and all the other days of the week, because Shabbos has its character given by the fact that God rested on that day. He made it special by what he did. This is what's called in our language, Isus Eila. It was an initiation from above without our playing any part in it, without our being party to it in any way. So Moses said to God, give it on Shabbos so that if it fails, then it won't have the same outcome as the Garden of Eden did. And he agreed. That's why, even though we did fail with the golden calf, he didn't cut off his relationship with us. That relationship is eternal. So, what you see here is that the Jewish people is carrying this ability to reach back into the Garden of Eden reality and to apply it in our world. That's not the same as being there, obviously. Being there and not in our world is a different. But they can reach out, bring it into this world, and make it relevant to this world, and only we can do that. So the humanity that God prepared for, hoped for, invested in, is what we call the life of Judaism. And that's why it's so important that others realize that although God doesn't command them to become Jewish, and they will be rewarded for what they do, and they can earn life in the world to come, but their lives aren't on the same level as the lives of Jews. They aren't on the same level. Yeah.
In the Shemona Esrei, it starts off by emphasizing our connection to the patriarchs and not to Adam and Hava necessarily. And you mentioned, like, are we sort of the continuation of them? And it sounds like Moshe particularly didn't necessarily want that we continue that legacy, because I guess we feel like we have a better shot that way. And also it feels like we're a different kind of creature because we're a redeeming creature. Adam's identity wasn't one of coming back from a fall. It was having a chance from a set of 0 and then failing that chance. Whereas our identity is trying to correct the mistake of that entity. So I hear that there is something of completion that's going on from there, but it sounds like there is enough of a nafkamina between the two identities that we're trying to connect ourselves more to the patriarchs than we are trying to connect ourselves to Adam.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure the structure of your question, but there's no question that we relate ourselves. By the way, when we say children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's a quotation from the Torah. That's what God wrote in the Torah, where we're using his words. So it isn't as if we're thinking things up or acting out our own philosophy. We're learning from God that that's what our identity has to be. I think that's right. You know, there's a whole intellectual flux in the air when you talk about groups and you talk about identities. Whether you reduce everything to the lowest common denominator, or whether you emphasize what's called exceptionalism, the unique features of a thing. Take a guy like poor fellow Peter Singer, who says that the whole morality is based on the capacity to suffer, which means there's no difference in principle between a human being and a dog and a fish, because they can all suffer. And the only thing that's important about morality is suffering. So nothing about what makes human beings different is relevant to morality. That's a type of thought of reducing things. If you want, I could make fun of it by saying, and what about a stone? We all take up space, don't we? Human being and the dog and the fish and the stone all take up space. Well, I want you to know that there's an attempt, the governor of Texas is putting up giant pontoons in the Rio Grande River to stop illegal immigrants from coming across. And there are people who are suing for the rights of the Rio Grande. You can't disturb a river. Who told you could disturb a river? Rivers have rights also. Yes, I'm making fun of it. No question about it. Making fun of it. Because reducing things to their common denominators it becomes absurd. The moon has a right not to be mined. There's a right to its own intactness and integrity. Fantasies. So you're right. To trace ourselves back to Adam, which is true, and we do sometimes do that, but your identity has to take account of the unique features that you have that make you supremely important. And those come from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Even Shem ve'Ever, who the patriarchs studied with them, studied their ideas, learned from them, but they didn't create this throwback to the Garden of Eden. They didn't create this throwback, this creation of a Eden-type identity in this world. So when we're talking about who we are, where we are, what we're supposed to be doing, that tracing back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob expresses the essence of our identity. The other does not. It's history, but it doesn't express the essence of our identity. In the morning, to daven the morning service, there's a certain time before which you shouldn't go. Sunrise for the Shemona Esrei, you shouldn't go before that. If you do, you've fulfilled it, but only second class. There's a word for someone, and by the way, this is very difficult because let's say in England, in the wintertime, the sun rises at 8 o'clock. It's very difficult to daven after. And sunrise and finish 8:30 and get downtown by 9 o'clock to go to work. It's a very difficult challenge. So the term for that is Terach's minyan, because Terach was Abraham's father. Terach was an idol worshiper. In the end of his life, he did tshuva. In the end of his life, he died at tzaddik, no question about it. But still, he was before, and just before, he didn't quite make it. And Abraham made it, and he made it for his children and his grandchildren. So the prehistory is important, but there's a difference between the prehistory of my nation and the history of my nation. By the way, I believe this applies also to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Jewish nation exists in Jacob's family, but not in Abraham's family and not in Isaac's family. Because Abraham and Isaac gave birth to non-Jewish children. So their families weren't the Jewish people in microcosm. Only Jacob had that. Chazal registered that with the word mita, so shlema, meaning that all his children were Jewish. He had a reality that didn't exist before them. So that sense, from the point of the Jewish people, Abraham and Isaac are like ancestors or progenitors of the Jewish people, but Jacob, and that's why the nation takes its name from Jacob, right? Yisrael is Jacob's name. We're not called after Abraham, we're not called after Isaac, because the nation came into existence with Jacob. So I think this is exactly right. The tracing us back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob gives us the essence of the identity that we have that shows why what we're doing is important. Yeah.
Just want to recap again for the Sinai experience and the similarities to the Garden of Eden. That death ended at that point, commandments were given, and there was an intimate connection with Hashem. Were there more as well?
I'm not quite getting what you say. At the Sinai experience, what?
I just wanted to recap
Yeah.
it again. That death ended. So that was
Temporarily. That was right. Yeah. Death ended, right.
Commandments were given.
That's right.
By both, and the intimate connection with Hashem.
Yes, but more than that, it should have been on Friday.
Okay.
God wanted it to be on Friday, and that's the tip-off that it really is supposed to be like the Garden of Eden. That's a tip-off.
And
Okay.
then for the inauguration of the Tabernacle, or when the Tabernacle was created, was not the tshuva that they were at a higher level even than God and Eden?
No, the Midrash says God's presence was with them in the Garden of Eden. failure after failure, God removed his presence layer by layer above. The patriarchs and the Jewish people brought it down layer by layer till it came to the tabernacle and returned to the way it was in the Garden of Eden. I didn't put that together before, but I think that's very important. It's not creating something new, it's restoring something that was before.
So the Sinai experience was restoring the Garden of Eden.
No, not the inside, not the science, but now we're talking about the building of the tabernacle.
Okay.
Right, God's purpose, because that was only temporary.
'Cause I would have thought
Then the
that
tabernacle is supposed to be permanent.
I would have thought that the tabernacle, because of tshuva, would have been even higher than Sinai.
No. In fact, the Ramban points out, the Ramban says, tabernacle is a portable Sinai. The same cloud that filled Sinai and prevented Moses from going up filled the tabernacle. The same conditions are written there. And that's why Sinai is nothing to us. Think about it. Mount Sinai is nothing. We have no tradition where it is. We don't care where it is. Christians think they know where it is. We have no reason to think that they're right. But it's of no interest, because what was there was taken with us. The place would be special if you left something behind. Something was still there, and you want to go there to celebrate that thing that was left behind. Nothing was left behind. It was taken with us. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not so familiar with the tabernacle. I don't know what you're referencing.
In the wilderness, they built a structure in which sacrifices were offered, in which the tablets that God gave Moses on Sinai were placed, and in which God's presence manifested itself directly. That they had. Then they took it into Israel, and they had it for hundreds of years in Israel. And then they built the temple in Jerusalem with some of the old materials. That was the permanent resting place. Last question here.
Yeah, so just to recap, our bottom line is pretty much, we're establishing from all these places, from Sinai, from Tabernacle, all these places, that what we establish out of all of this is that Hashem, through the Jewish people, is trying to restore what he tried to create.
Yes, so let's go back to the very beginning. Is God interested in the two-tiered humanity? No. But that doesn't mean there aren't two tiers. There are two tiers, and the reconciliation would be if everyone would join the top tier. That's what God tried to accomplish 4 times. So I'm not denying that there are two tiers. I'm denying that that's God's purpose. And those who would assimilate the two tiers, Jews and non-Jews, to something like the nobility in Europe or the caste system in India, the gigantic difference is that those are hereditary. Okay, now, because Europe's so poor, rich Americans can buy titles. But the Europeans don't look at them as they really have the title. You know, they look at them as rich Americans who want a name. Yeah, it's a joke. Nobility was a caste system based on birth. If you can join the superior group by will, it's hard to call that a prejudicial system. You know, if you really think something actually valuable there, join. Okay.